Very much indeed. We're going to move now to the five-year forward view. Ian will talk to the paper, I think, but Simon, you might wish to say some words by way of introduction.
So I don't think we're going to have necessarily a long conversation at this point, Malcolm, because we've got more work to do with our national partners, as I said right at the start, in terms of what the process looks like for catalysing some of the local conversations that now need to take place across the country as to what are some of the care models that people might choose to develop, what sort of support is required, how this all comes together with the payment rules, the regulatory, the inspection, the offer that we set out in Chapter 4 for the national bodies to do things differently to help support those processes. But I think all I would say at this point is that you can perhaps think of 4 types of health community which might require different types of support. There are those where they are in effect already in shadow form or pretty close to what one or other of the new care models looks like, and we even mention some real world examples through the forward view to show that this is the art of the possible rather than just a speculative future. So for those people, really, we just need to structure conversation about what they need in order to make the next steps and get going to full maturity pretty quickly. Other end of the spectrum, second group, would be parts of the country where, frankly, they are in very deep financial and service pressure, and so they know they're going to need to do something quite radically different with the way care is organised, and so there is a clear appetite and necessity to get on with that, not from a position of strength, but from a position of back against the wall, in effect. Thirdly, then, there are, which probably be the most parts of the country, where they have got some degrees of freedom in terms of what are the choices they make, and exactly what is the process by which those conversations take place locally to identify what their best strategic option is. That's the conversation we want to have with CCGs, with providers, with third sector partners, with local authorities to get that right. But we want those processes, those conversations kicked off in a quite tangible way so that come next spring we have a point of view on what this will look like, and indeed can then put some indicative costings around what the sort of kickstart investments might be needed. And then the fourth and much smaller group of places will be those that we refer to in the forward view as the new towns or the high population growth areas where there aren't a lot of legacy health services, and we've got an opportunity to frankly think completely differently about what a modern health service might look like there, unencumbered by prior ways of working or legacy assets. That's potentially very, very exciting. We are just mapping where those geographies are. A number of people have come forward to us and said they think they qualify for that. So that those sort of 4 different zones, if you like, I think will have different rhythms, different opportunities, but all 4 of them we want to advance between now and spring.
Thank you. Yeah.
Ian. So if I may, very briefly, so we will be doing further work, as Simon has alluded, with the 5 other national partners on how we then unlock energy nationally and locally. There was a lot of support from other national organisations, so we will be thinking collectively about how do we build and maintain that wider sense of coalition for change with our national partners. And I think thirdly, just tying this conversation back to the earlier item, I think it will be really critical for us to approach this in a spirit of openness and engagement with the public and with users of services, the voluntary sector, a range of different providers, rather than just the statutory bodies and those involved in the current delivery of care. Just adding to Simon's typology, one of the challenges I think we will face is around how do we structure the national-local dialogue. How do we manage to avoid repeating some of the mistakes around pilots in the past, and tread this path between the single national blueprint and the thousand flowers bloom. So I think there's quite a lot of work for us to do around establishing a method so that the interested areas, whether they're in shadow form now or are some of the other categories that Simon alluded to, can end up getting structured support, that we can identify patterns across different areas so that we can construct some prototypes that can then be replicated more easily across the NHS subsequently. And I think those are some of the challenges that we will undoubtedly want to come back to as a board with our ALB partners and with the wider community of interests both nationally and locally.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just think particularly importantly about behaviours, because I think in terms of process, we have to design the processes and the mechanisms, and we're all quite good at doing that. But I come back to this sort of coalition and collaboration and what that actually means day in, day out, because I can't say that it's necessarily been a piece of DNA in the whole of the NHS that one sees naturally day in, day out across perhaps leadership groups. So we need to get to a state where it is the reflex to be collaborative, not to think about the need to be collaborative. And that's quite a skill, because we may trip up, we may make a mistake, we may look like a big beast when we want to be collaborative, and it's important that we then apologise to our partners, or we recognise that might have come across the wrong way, and because real collaboration is very different to talking about collaboration. So I just hope that we can do that in all the groups that we're in, and that our partners will do that with us as well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, real collaboration is driven by a vision that there's a win for all at the end of it. I think the critical thing that we all get around the 5-year forward view is that there is a very mixed history of visionary thinking in the NHS. And this one has to work for reasons that we all understand. That we would wish, I think, as a board to ensure that the 5-year forward view now informs everything that we do, that it wraps into all of our committee work. We're coming up in a moment to talk about commissioning. Well, commissioning is the major function that we perform. But commissioning in this new environment, collaborative, as Ez says, working with our partners, but also with a keen eye on the outcomes that we wish to achieve. I think we'd also anticipate that the board will roll up its sleeves and work very hard with the executive team in identifying the priorities and in taking the movement forward, and also bringing back to every board meeting as the major item of our business the development and implementation of the forward view. Good. Well, we will, on that note, return to it, but noting in particular Ed's comments about collaboration and the new environment in which we're working. I'd like to move now, please, to item 7 on the agenda, which are the commissioning arrangements for 2015-16. There are two aspects to this. The first on specialised commissioning with Barbara, and the second on primary care co-commissioning. I'll, however, ask Simon if there are introductory comments you'd like to make.
Thank you. So on specialised, we have listened carefully, particularly to CCG partners, but also other patient groups, about the speed at which we can make progress to try and ensure holistic place-based budgets, while nevertheless recognising the benefit of national standardisation on quality and access. And there are obviously trade-offs to be made there. So the proposal in front of the board is for a relatively modest set of incremental changes for next year that in effect ensure that NHS England continues to be the principal statutory commissioner of specialised services, but which provides a series of fora in which CCGs can join with us to help shape the decisions that need to be made, and to the extent it is possible to make savings from downstream care that could be invested in upstream prevention or more appropriate services, of the sort that, for example, were being discussed by the Health Select Committee in respect of the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services and CAMS Tier 4, very graphically demonstrating the benefit of enabling funds to move from more intensive downstream care to upstream support. Then CCGs will have the ability to share in some of those savings to build local services. So this is a modest, pragmatic step forward to enabling that kind of place-based development of local services while continuing to ensure national standards and shared sophistication around some of the commissioning of these more specialised services. But Barbara, do you want to start on that? And then I'll just say a word before Ian gets on to primary care.
Good.
So, thank you. Building on what what Simon's just said, the paper starts by identifying how specialised services are defined and the portfolio which changes depending on the recommendations that ministers take from the Specialised Services Advisory Group. It then goes on to identify, as Simon said, some of the reasons why we want to work much more closely with CCGs in terms of specialised commissioning. We absolutely understand the need for national standards, particularly for those elements of specialised commissioning which truly are specialised. It's a very broad mix of some services which are very specialised, and maybe only one or two places in the country providers deliver those services, through to the sorts of services which are delivered almost in every CCG, and certainly across every patch of 2 or 3 CCGs. I think it's also important to remember that commissioning is not one action. There is no one size fits all for commissioning. There's no one right size for it. You need to tailor the different aspects to how it fits for the population. I think this is particularly true of specialised commissioning. I think one of the things we found is that if you don't attribute the budget of specialised commissioning in the way you do of the rest of the budget, which we do to CCGs, even if they might not take responsibility for that budget, and even if NHS England retains the responsibility for that, but just for people to be able to see what is being spent on a place, and to give you the opportunity to move payments downstream and do what we know all patients want, and that's prevent them from getting seriously ill if we possibly can do. But that's a different level of geography from the one on which you might design a service. So if you're designing a service, if there are only a couple of national centres that do it, you probably have to look at a national footprint. And the same goes for patient and public engagement. For very rare disorders, where there are only a few people with them, that engagement has to be done at a national level. For more common disorders, it's much easier for people to be engaged in their locality and that's what the CCGs do. And then the final part, well, there are many parts of commissioning, but another, I think, important part is risk management, because some of the specialised services are rare, but very, very expensive, and small organisations need to be protected from the statistical vagaries of how many patients you'll have with any disorder in a given year. So that risk pooling will be key and critical. And we do absolutely understand and are working closely with partners, particularly the Specialist Healthcare Alliance and others. We'll be working closely with them to make sure that we continue with the principles that Simon outlined, that integrity of a national approach, that certainty that this is tailored particularly for rare disorders, but whilst getting closer to CCGs, allowing them to have much more say and impact, making sure that these services are integrated with the day-to-day services that the CCGs commission. So we're proposing to continue to work with PSAG and to identify which services really perhaps have become so commonly delivered for patients that they should no longer be on that list, and they would then officially move, with Minister's approval, to being commissioned by CCGs. There is a small cadre of services which are so highly specialised that we recognise that actually trying to support CCGs, we'd have to have a collaboration of CCGs across the whole of England, so therefore they will continue to be within the province of NHS England. But there is this big chunk in the middle whereby, with really great CCG collaboration, which we have a responsibility to oversee, in fact even outside specialised, it's one of the domains of the CCG authorisation assurance framework that they can collaborate. But supporting them to collaborate, we want to work with them to identify how they can be much more involved under co-commissioning now that we can form a joint committee with them, to make sure that those patients with specialised services get not only the very best services they can, but the sorts of services which are seamless and work well, because patients with specialised conditions don't only need care for those conditions, they need care for the full gamut of other things as well.
Thank you, Barbara. Comments on specialised? Moira?
A question to Barbara Malcolm, please, about the involvement of CSUs in the process. Are they central to the new model that they're seeking to develop?
I think CSUs are central to any commissioning that we do. They are the repository of expertise and understanding of commissioning processes in a way that even we in NHS England, however big we are, can't have, and certainly CCGs individually can't have. But I agree with you, nowhere is it more important in specialised that we fully understand the needs of the patients, that the business intelligence is right, that the transforming of services, that full range of things that CSUs do. It's key to specialised, but I think it's key to the NHS being a great commissioner, because if we don't use that level of expertise that we've got in CSUs, it'll be a great shame. It'll be poorer services for patients, and it certainly won't be value for money for the taxpayer.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. We are coming later on to an item around reorganisation of board committees, and the proposal there is that there will be a board committee dedicated to specialised commissioning to carry forward this programme. Simon, you wanted to say some words?
So on primary care co-commissioning, we've talked about the principles of this at several meetings. There's been very wide support for this from across CCGs, recognising that they have three options as to how they want to pursue it, and we use the NHS Commissioning Assembly to really have a shared conversation about what the mechanics of these various options would look like. I think Ian will talk you through the specifics, although I think I would suggest that the board specifically might want to address the questions of handling conflicts of interest and just make sure that everybody feels comfortable with the proposal that's been developed here, or if there are other propositions that people want to have in place, then we should certainly discuss that now as well.
Okay. Ian?
Thank you, Chair. So as Simon was saying, the purpose of this is to unlock the expertise and the energy in CCG communities to improve primary care, to join up pathways better, and to be able to make more rounded prioritisation decisions around upstream care, and support place-based commissioning as we've set out in the 5-year forward view. The process of developing co-commissioning has been a highly collaborative one. Not just with the NHS Commissioning Assembly, but with CCG leaders, and I've jointly chaired a group with Amanda Doyle, who is the joint chair of NHS Clinical Commissioners, to develop these arrangements. We've also involved lay members, regional and area teams, and local government representatives in the design of these arrangements. We quite early on concluded that there was scope to learn from the numerous expressions of interest from CCGs and develop a more simpler and standardised approach to co-commissioning. And so we have developed a single arrangement for joint committees and a single model for delegation, which excludes medical revalidation and the performers list arrangements, rather than run with what were 74 marginally different variants that came back from the expressions of interest from CCGs. We also concluded that it would be very important to deal with the perception and the reality of managing conflicts of interest in a very robust way. And so we have developed a set of propositions on which we are intending formally to consult. So when we publish the guidance document to CCGs, it will provide more information, we hope early next week. We will set out those arrangements and invite formal comments back before issuing for the first time in this area statutory guidance on the handling of conflicts of interest. Our propositions are clear rules around the governance of decisions, with a lay chair and a lay and executive majority rather than a clinical majority, training for the lay chair and lay members, which we would run nationally and aim to complete by the end of March next year. We would mandate the invitation to attend the decision-making committee within CCGs of local representatives of local Health Watch and indeed local authority members of the Health and Wellbeing Board, who would have the right to attend as observers. We would insist on there being a clear register of interests and a register of decisions that are made, procurement decisions that are made, that we would then expect to be included within the annual report and accounts and signed off by the auditors. So those are our propositions in relation to conflicts of interest, and we've been having a number of conversations, including with Monitor and informally with the NAO around those arrangements. We also concluded that it would be very important to ensure national consistency across the different contractual forms on a number of areas where it would be self-evidently odd to allow variation. So, for example, we are introducing in GMS a new set of requirements around transparency of GP earnings, and CCGs collectively and the profession will absolutely want to make sure that that applies across all forms of contracting. So we will have a mechanism to be able to insist on national rules that apply across all forms of primary care commissioning. Alongside that, one of the purposes of co-commissioning of primary care is to enable local CCGs to be able to respond better and more effectively to their local priorities and needs, as, for example, set out in the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment and the Joint Health and Wellbeing Strategies developed in health and wellbeing boards. So alongside the ability to insist on national rules, we're proposing that CCGs have the freedom to design their own local arrangements. This could include different incentive schemes. I do think it's important to point out that any GMS GPs will continue to have an entitlement to the national QOF arrangements should they so wish. So there would not be an ability of CCGs to set aside those legal rights. It would be a matter entirely for the individual GMS practitioners to decide to waive them should they so wish. So that's the set of propositions in relation to standing rules and local flexibilities. On administrative resources, one of the issues that CCGs, I think, have been most concerned by is the relative paucity of administrative resource which is currently available to support the commissioning of primary medical care services post the restructuring in the last year or so. The ratio of staff within NHS England area teams to contracts is very high. We are, I think, collectively mindful of that particular challenge. What we are looking to do is to ensure that in relation to the relevant functions that would be delegated to CCGs, that CCGs have access to the fair proportion of resource that is currently involved after the restructuring exercise that NHS England is embarked in, but without transferring staff and creating additional HR complication and process and uncertainty to those staff. CCGs will have the ability to clearly supplement those administrative resources from within their administrative resources. The final point I wanted to make is that the implementation timetable on this is quite tight. We think it is doable. There's been a number of conversations, I think, that are happening now across the country already around the practicality of the arrangements. and also informally around the resource envelope that would be going to CCGs. And we have established a programme of roadshows and communications to support delivery by the end of March. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we all realise that both of these papers represent a major step for the board, which we're being asked to sign off today. It's evolutionary rather than revolutionary. I think it reflects the settling down of the system, but it is raising expectations of the performance of CCGs. One of the reasons why we started out with a very significant distinction between these functions was our concern about conflict of interest. And you've touched upon that in your address, and you've touched upon it very well in the paper. I just have to ask a question or two about how you perceive the role of lay members on CCG boards in securing for us the protection that we absolutely need against any perception of conflict of interest, because that would undermine the credibility of what we're doing. You see, we want on the one hand, don't we, to harness the local intelligence, the local resource, the enthusiasm that so many CCGs have for delivering a different model of primary care and tying it in with the 5-year view. But at the same time, that credibility is undermined if there is a suspicion of conflict of interest. So can you just take us through, perhaps a little further, the role of lay members and how they can be better engaged in overseeing that process?
So we've been very mindful, as we've been developing these proposals, of the need to engage with lay members and hear their views and their perspectives as to how well the current arrangements are working. I think these new arrangements will further highlight the critical importance of their role within CCGs. They currently have a key role in relation to making decisions where there are potential conflicts, and it is the case now that CCGs can choose to develop local schemes, for example, APMS contracts or some local enhanced services where there is contracting with primary care practitioners, which is from within the CCG budget out with the existing area team budget. So this is not entirely new in that regard. They already are involved in making decisions. But with the potential delegation of a much more significant budget arrangement, we think it's really critical that we set out the arrangements for the decision making to be a lay chair, for there to be a majority of non-clinical members. One of the, I think, pieces of feedback that we've heard from the lay members is that they would welcome some further advice and training on how the co-commissioning arrangement should work, which is why we are proposing to establish a national training programme and to make sure that that's rolled out before the arrangements come into effect.
Yes.
So being a member of the Brotherhood of Chairs of Audit Committees, I think I ought to just sort of reflect on the fact that the last couple of weeks we've had the CCG audit chairs at workshops, and the generic point is that they sometimes feel they're not aware of all of the things that perhaps they should be aware of, and so I think firstly this consultation should be sent directly to them because of their special role in the overall governance of CCGs. I think it's a really important point. Secondly, following that, we have another set of audit chair workshops in January, February. I would like to make this subject a key theme for that, and obviously welcome you and other colleagues to come to that. Thirdly, looking at the guidance, I just think I would rather go a stage further, which is to put a specific responsibility on the audit committee chair to provide some attestation back to to us as NHS England on the compliance and the execution of all of this conflicts of interest matters. I just think it's such an important subject, both in terms of perception and reality, that attestation, it's an obligation which we wouldn't take lightly, is a really important part of the mechanisms of governance.
Ian, would you take that back and...
That's a very helpful suggestion, thank you.
Right, well, thank you. We're being asked as a board to do 2 or 3 things. First of all, I think to agree the principles in both papers, in other words, on specialised commissioning as well as on co-commissioning of primary care, to approve the 3 models for co-commissioning of primary care, to take on board the assurances that we've received regarding conflicts of interest, but to add to it the attestation by audit committee chairs along the lines that Ed has suggested, and to approve the proposals for flexibilities in contracts. We've already done some of this, as you've pointed out, in the past. And then finally, the national principles for the deployment of the administrative resources, as Ian has outlined. May I invite the board to approve each of those? Good. I'm grateful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian and Barbara.